Officer Greg Harper adjusted his cap as he sat in his patrol car, sipping lukewarm coffee while scanning the quiet suburban street. It was another slow night in Willow Creek, a town known more for its manicured lawns and polite neighbors than any real trouble. Still, Greg prided himself on being vigilant. He believed that keeping order meant paying attention to details others might overlook. Unfortunately, those details often came with biases Greg wasn't even aware he carried. He drove down Maple Avenue. A black sedan caught his eye. The car was parked at an odd angle near the curb, its engine running. Behind the wheel sat a tall man wearing a crisp suit, scrolling through his phone. Something about the scene didn't sit right with Greg. To him, it looked suspicious. Too polished, too out of place in this sleepy neighborhood. Without hesitation, he pulled up behind the vehicle, activating his flashing lights. The driver glanced into his rearview mirror, clearly startled but composed. He turned off the engine, rolled down his window, and waited patiently as Greg approached. His posture was calm, almost serene, which only fueled Greg's skepticism. In his mind, people who acted so collected during routine stops always had something to hide. License and registration, Greg barked, his tone sharper than necessary. The man nodded politely, reaching into the glove compartment. "Of course, officer," he said smoothly, handing over the requested documents. His voice carried an air of confidence that made Greg uneasy. Greg studied the ID closely. The name read Marcus Thompson. Everything seemed legitimate. His license, the car registration, but something still gnawed at Greg. Maybe it was Marcus's spotless attire or how effortlessly respectful he appeared. People like him usually weren't so cooperative, at least not according to Greg's skewed perception. "You live around here?" Greg asked gruffly, flipping through the papers again. "Just to buy time?" "No, sir," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm visiting someone nearby." Greg raised an eyebrow. "Visiting at this hour? Who?" For the first time, Marcus hesitated, but instead of looking guilty, he simply smiled faintly. "An old friend. I'm sure you understand how these things go." Greg didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes darted toward the back seat of the sedan. There was nothing unusual there. A briefcase resting against the seat, no signs of anything illegal. Yet his instincts, or perhaps his prejudices, kept screaming at him to dig deeper. "Step out of the vehicle," Greg ordered abruptly, stepping back to give Marcus room. Marcus complied without argument, maintaining his composure despite the growing tension. As he stood under the dim glow of the streetlight, Greg couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. Little did he know, this seemingly ordinary traffic stop would unravel far beyond what he could imagine, and challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, authority, and himself. Greg's flashlight beam swept over Marcus as he stood beside his car, hands resting lightly on the roof. The officer's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing every detail. The way Marcus held himself, the faint crease of his expensive suit jacket, even the polished shine of his shoes. Everything about this man screamed out of place to Greg, and that only deepened his suspicion. "Why are you really here?" Greg asked sharply, his voice carrying an edge of accusation. He had already decided in his mind that Marcus was hiding something, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it might be. Marcus met Greg's gaze with steady eyes. "I told you, officer. I'm visiting a friend. Is there a problem?" Greg ignored the question. Instead, he gestured toward the briefcase on the back seat. "What's in there?" Marcus glanced at the briefcase briefly before returning his attention to Greg. "Just some papers," he said evenly. "Work-related." The calmness in Marcus's tone irritated Greg further. It wasn't defiance exactly, but there was an unshakable confidence in the way Marcus spoke. A quiet assurance that made Greg feel like he was losing control of the situation. And Greg hated feeling out of control. "Open it," Greg demanded, stepping closer. Without hesitation, Marcus retrieved the briefcase from the back seat and clicked it open. Inside were neatly stacked documents, folders, and what appeared to be a badge holder. Greg leaned in for a better look, his frown deepening. "What kind of work do you do?" Greg pressed. trying to sound authoritative despite the flicker of doubt creeping into his mind. "I'm a consultant," Marcus replied smoothly, closing the briefcase. "But I don't think my profession is relevant to why you pulled me over." Greg bristled at the subtle challenge in Marcus's words. Who did this guy think he was? Some hotshot who could talk circles around him? Determined to assert dominance, Greg crossed his arms. "You're parked in a residential area late at night. That makes it relevant." Marcus sighed softly, shaking his head. "If you're looking for trouble, officer, you won't find it here. I haven't broken any laws." For a moment, Greg hesitated. Logically, Marcus was right. He hadn't done anything wrong. But logic wasn't driving Greg's actions. Tonight, years of ingrained biases were whispering louder than reason. Every stereotype Greg had ever heard about men like Marcus replayed in his head, fueling his determination to prove something, even if he wasn't sure what. "Let's see your phone," Greg said abruptly, surprising even himself with the request. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "My phone? Why?" "Because I said so," Greg snapped, his patience wearing thin. "Do you have something to hide?" Marcus studied Greg for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he handed over his phone. As Greg scrolled through it, searching for, well, he wasn't sure what, Marcus spoke again. "You seem very eager to find fault where none exists," Marcus observed quietly. "Tell me, officer, what exactly am I guilty of?" The question hit Greg like a punch to the gut. For a split second, he felt the weight of his own behavior pressing down on him. Was he being unfair? Overzealous? No, he told himself firmly. This wasn't about race or bias. It was about doing his job, keeping the streets safe. If someone didn't want to be questioned, maybe they had something to hide. But as Greg continued examining the phone, one notification caught his eye. A text message from someone named Agent Reynolds. The message read, "Status update needed. How's the operation going?" Greg froze. Operation? What operation? Suddenly, doubt swirled in his mind. Could Marcus actually be involved in something bigger than a simple traffic stop? Or was Greg letting his imagination run wild? Unsure of what to do next, Greg made a decision that would change everything. He called for backup. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the quiet night, drawing curious glances from a few nearby houses. 2 additional patrol cars pulled up behind Greg's vehicle, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. Officers Linda Carter and Jake Miller stepped out, both wearing expressions of mild confusion as they approached Greg and Marcus. "What's going on here?" Linda asked, her voice calm but firm. She was known for her level-headedness, a stark contrast to Greg's brash demeanor. Greg gestured toward Marcus. "This guy's acting suspicious. I stopped him for parking oddly, but something doesn't add up. Look at his phone. There's a message about some kind of operation. Could be code for something illegal." Linda frowned slightly, glancing at Marcus. "Sir, can you explain what this is about?" Marcus nodded, his composure unwavering despite the growing audience. "Of course, I'm working undercover. That text refers to a federal investigation I'm involved in. If you'd like, I can provide further clarification, but not here. It's sensitive information." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Undercover? You expect us to believe that?" Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the badge holder Greg had noticed earlier. He flipped it open, revealing a shiny FBI insignia along with credentials identifying him as Special Agent Marcus Thompson. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Greg stared at the badge, his face reddening as realization dawned. He had just accused and harassed a federal agent. The weight of his mistake crashed down on him, though pride kept him from admitting it outright. "You're FBI?" Linda asked cautiously, her tone shifting to one of respect. "Yes," Marcus replied evenly. "And while I understand your concerns, Officer Harper's conduct tonight has been inappropriate. I'll need to report this incident once my current assignment is complete." Greg clenched his jaw, anger bubbling beneath the surface. How dare this man make him look foolish? You could have said something sooner, he muttered defensively, instead of letting me waste everyone's time. Marcus fixed Greg with a steady gaze. I gave you every opportunity to de-escalate this situation. Unfortunately, your assumptions spoke louder than my words. The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to slice with a knife. Linda cleared her throat, stepping in to diffuse the mounting hostility. All right, let's all take a step back. Agent Thompson, we apologize for the misunderstanding. Your work must remain confidential, so we won't ask details. But if there's anything we can do to assist, no assistance needed. Marcus interrupted politely. Just a reminder to trust people until they give you a reason not to. His words carried a subtle sting, aimed squarely at Greg. Feeling cornered, Greg snapped back. Trust doesn't mean ignoring instinct. My job is to protect this town, and I won't apologize for doing it. Marcus shook his head slightly as if pitying Greg's narrow perspective. Instinct is valuable, Officer Harper, but when it's clouded by bias, it becomes dangerous for everyone. Before Greg could retort, Linda intervened again. Agent Thompson, thank you for your understanding. We'll let you get back to your duties. And Harper, she shot Greg a pointed look. Let's wrap this up. Reluctantly, Greg stepped aside, allowing Marcus to return to his car. As Marcus slid behind the wheel, he glanced at Greg one last time. Good night, officer. Try to remember that not everything is as it seems. With that, Marcus drove off, leaving Greg standing under the harsh glare of the patrol car lights. For the first time in years, Greg felt truly unsettled, not by fear, but by doubt. Had he let his biases dictate his actions tonight? And if so, how many others had he wronged without realizing it? As the other officers dispersed, Greg remained rooted to the spot, staring after Marcus's taillights long after they disappeared into the darkness. The ride back to the station was silent, save for the low hum of the patrol car's engine. Greg gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he replayed the night's events in his mind. Each moment felt like a punch to his pride. Marcus's calm demeanor, the flash of the FBI badge, and worst of all, the subtle accusation that Greg's judgment had been clouded by bias. It wasn't true, was it? He had just been doing his job, protecting the community, keeping people safe. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, the doubt lingered. When Greg walked into the precinct, Captain Reynolds was waiting for him. A stern man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair, Reynolds didn't waste time beating around the bush. What happened out there, Harper? He demanded, folding his arms across his chest. Greg hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I pulled over a suspicious individual, sir. Turned out he was FBI, undercover. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Suspicious how? He was parked in a residential area late at night, Greg explained, his voice tinged with defensiveness. And he didn't live nearby. Plus, there was something off about him, his attitude, his answers. I thought it warranted further investigation. And did you find anything illegal? Reynolds pressed, his tone sharpening. No, sir, Greg admitted reluctantly. But then why are we having this conversation? Reynolds interrupted, his frustration evident. You know better than to escalate situations based on hunches, especially when they involve federal agents. Do you have any idea how much trouble this could have caused? Greg bristled at the reprimand. I was following protocol, Captain. If someone seems out of place, it's my duty to look into it. Reynolds sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. Harper, being thorough is one thing. Letting your assumptions dictate your actions is another. Was this really about protecting the neighborhood, or were you jumping to conclusions because of who he was? The question hit Greg like a freight train. He opened his mouth to argue but found himself unable to form a coherent response. Instead, he looked away, his jaw tightening. Sensing Greg's discomfort, Reynolds softened his tone slightly. Listen, Harper, I'm not saying you're a bad cop, but if you want to keep wearing that badge, you need to check yourself. People trust us to act fairly, not let personal biases get in the way. Greg nodded stiffly, though inside he felt a storm brewing. Was Reynolds implying he was prejudiced? That wasn't fair. He treated everyone equally, didn't he? As the captain dismissed him, Greg retreated to his desk, staring blankly at the paperwork piled in front of him. His thoughts kept drifting back to Marcus, the way he'd handled the situation with such composure, almost as if he'd expected it. Had Marcus dealt with officers like Greg before? Officers who judged him before giving him a chance to speak? The idea unsettled Greg more than he cared to admit. Later that evening, as Greg drove home, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted. For years he'd prided himself on his instincts, his ability to read people. But now, doubt gnawed at him. What if his instincts weren't as reliable as he thought? What if they were shaped by things he didn't even realize? Pulling into his driveway, Greg sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the darkened windows of his house. Somewhere deep down, he knew tonight wouldn't be forgotten easily. Not by him, and certainly not by Marcus Thompson. The next morning, Greg woke up feeling unusually restless. Sleep had been elusive the night before, his mind replaying Marcus's parting words over and over again. Try to remember that not everything is as it seems. The phrase echoed in his head like a haunting melody, refusing to fade. He tried to brush it off as he got ready for work, telling himself it was just another day on the job. But deep down, something felt different. At the station, whispers about the previous night's incident had already begun to circulate among the other officers. Greg could feel their eyes on him as he walked past, some curious, others judgmental. He hated the attention, not because he cared what they thought, but because it reminded him of his own failure. Failure to see beyond his assumptions. Failure to act with fairness. Determined to distract himself, Greg buried himself in routine tasks, filing reports, checking patrol logs, anything to keep his mind occupied. But no matter how hard he tried, his thoughts kept drifting back to Marcus. Who was he really? What kind of operation was he working on? And why did Greg feel so unsettled by the encounter? Later that afternoon, Captain Reynolds called Greg into his office. To Greg's surprise, there was someone else waiting inside. A tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit. It took Greg a moment to recognize him without the sedan or the streetlights, but when he did, his stomach sank. It was Marcus Thompson. Agent Thompson stopped by to discuss last night, Reynolds explained, gesturing for Greg to take a seat. I thought it would be best if we cleared the air. Greg nodded stiffly, avoiding eye contact with Marcus as he sat down. The room felt suffocatingly small, the tension between them almost tangible. Marcus spoke first, his voice calm but firm. Officer Harper, I'm not here to make trouble for you. I understand that your intentions were good. However, incidents like last night can have serious consequences, not just for law enforcement, but for the communities we serve. Greg clenched his fists under the table, struggling to keep his emotions in check. I was doing my job, he said through gritted teeth. If I hadn't investigated, and you turned out to be dangerous, what then? Marcus leaned forward, slightly, his expression thoughtful. And if I hadn't been FBI? If I'd been an ordinary citizen, how do you think I would have felt? Being detained and questioned simply because of where I was parked, or perhaps because of how I look? The question struck a nerve. Greg wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, he knew Marcus had a point. He had let his suspicions override logic, jumping to conclusions, without evidence. But admitting it aloud felt like swallowing poison. Reynolds interjected gently, sensing Greg's discomfort. Agent Thompson has agreed not to file a formal complaint, provided we address the underlying issues. That includes mandatory bias training for all officers, starting with you, Harper. Greg's face flushed with embarrassment. Training? For him? He opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus cut him off. This isn't about punishment, Marcus said evenly. It's about growth. You hold a position of authority, Officer Harper. With that comes responsibility. To protect, yes, but also to respect. Every interaction matters. Every decision shapes trust or distrust in the system. For the first time, Greg looked directly at Marcus, There was no anger in the agent's eyes, only understanding. It wasn't condescending or mocking, it was genuine, and that made Greg even more uncomfortable. As the meeting concluded, Greg found himself walking out of the office with a heavy heart. Marcus's final words lingered in his mind. Change starts with awareness. Don't waste this opportunity to grow. Back at his desk, Greg stared blankly at the wall, his thoughts swirling. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe it was time to confront the biases he didn't even realize he carried. But change wouldn't come easily, and Greg wasn't sure he was ready for it. The days that followed were some of the most challenging in Greg Harper's career. Mandatory bias training sessions began promptly, and though he attended them reluctantly, each lesson forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the world around him. The instructor, a soft-spoken yet sharp-witted woman named Dr. Elena Cruz, didn't mince words. She spoke candidly about systemic prejudices, implicit biases, and how even well-meaning individuals could perpetuate harm without realizing it. At first, Greg resisted. He sat through the sessions with crossed arms and a scowl, convinced that this was all unnecessary. "I treat everyone the same," he muttered under his breath during one particularly intense discussion on racial profiling. But as the weeks went by, examples from real-life cases began to sink in. Stories of innocent people whose lives had been upended by assumptions made in moments of haste. Stories that mirrored his own actions with Marcus. One exercise stood out in particular. Participants were asked to pair up and share personal experiences where they felt judged or misunderstood based on stereotypes. When it was Greg's turn, he struggled to think of an example. "I don't know what to say," he admitted awkwardly. "I've never been discriminated against." His partner, a younger officer named Mia Torres, gave him a knowing look. "Maybe that's part of the problem," she said gently. "You haven't walked in someone else's shoes. Have you ever stopped to wonder what it's like for them?" Her words lingered long after the session ended. That night, unable to sleep, Greg found himself scrolling through news articles and videos online. Stories of black men and women who had been wrongfully targeted by law enforcement. Some had faced minor inconveniences. Others had suffered far worse. As he watched footage of tearful families recounting their losses, Greg felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine Marcus in those situations, not as an FBI agent, but as just another person trying to live his life. It wasn't easy. Every revelation chipped away at the walls Greg had built around his beliefs, forcing him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew. Slowly, painfully, he began to see the cracks in his own perspective, the subtle ways his biases had influenced his decisions over the years. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson remained a constant presence in Greg's mind. Though they hadn't crossed paths since the meeting with Captain Reynolds, Greg often wondered if Marcus thought about him too. Was he disappointed? Disgusted? Or did he genuinely believe Greg could change? One evening, while patrolling Willow Creek, Greg noticed a familiar black sedan parked near the park. His heart skipped a beat when he saw Marcus standing beside it, speaking with a group of teenagers. They laughed and nodded enthusiastically as Marcus handed out pamphlets promoting community safety programs. It was clear he was building trust, a stark contrast to Greg's earlier approach. Hesitant but curious, Greg approached cautiously. Marcus spotted him immediately and offered a polite nod. "Officer Harper," he greeted, his tone neutral. "Agent Thompson," Greg replied, unsure of what else to say. After a moment, he added, "I wanted to thank you for not filing a complaint." Marcus studied him for a moment before responding. "Thank your captain, and yourself, for showing up to the training." Greg nodded slowly, feeling a flicker of hope. "I'm trying," he admitted quietly, "to do better." Marcus smiled faintly, the gesture carrying a hint of encouragement. That's all anyone can ask for. As Greg returned to his patrol car, he realized something important. Change wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to take the first step. Weeks turned into months, and Greg Harper continued to work on himself. The journey wasn't easy. There were days when old habits crept back in, moments when doubt clouded his progress. But each time he caught himself slipping, he remembered Marcus's words. Change starts with awareness. And so, Greg pushed forward, determined to prove that he could be better, not just for himself but for the community he swore to protect. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. Fellow officers began to see a shift in Greg's behavior. He no longer jumped to conclusions during traffic stops or let preconceived notions dictate his actions. Instead, he took the time to listen, to truly understand the people he encountered. It was a small change, but one that made a big difference. Residents who had once avoided eye contact with him now greeted him warmly, their trust slowly rebuilding. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Greg patrolled downtown Willow Creek, he spotted Marcus again. This time the agent was alone, leaning casually against his sedan while scrolling through his phone. When Marcus noticed Greg pulling up beside him, he straightened and offered a friendly smile. "Officer Harper," Marcus said, tipping his head slightly. "Good to see you." Greg stepped out of his patrol car feeling a mix of nerves and gratitude. "Agent Thompson, what brings you here?" "I'm wrapping up my assignment in town," Marcus replied. "Thought I'd take one last look around before heading out." Greg hesitated, then decided to speak from the heart. "I wanted to say, I've been thinking a lot about what you said that night, about not judging people before giving them a chance. I've tried to apply that, to really listen instead of assuming." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "That's all anyone can do. Try. Progress isn't perfect, but it's worth striving for." Greg swallowed hard, gathering the courage to say what had been weighing on his mind. "I owe you an apology for how I treated you that night. I let my biases get in the way, and I'm sorry." For a moment, Marcus simply looked at him, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you, Officer Harper. That means more than you know." The two men stood there for a moment, the air between them lighter than it had ever been. Finally, Marcus extended his hand. "Take care of this town, all right? You've got a chance to make things right, not just for yourself, but for everyone." Greg shook his hand firmly, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "I will. Thanks. For everything." As Marcus climbed into his sedan and drove away, Greg watched until the car disappeared from sight. He felt a quiet pride swelling within him, not because he had arrived at his destination, but because he knew he was finally on the right path. Later that evening, as Greg sat in his patrol car overlooking the quiet streets of Willow Creek, he reflected on how far he'd come. Change wasn't easy. It never was. But every interaction, every decision mattered. And for the first time in years, Greg felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for the future of the community he served. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but Greg was ready to face it one step at a time.